Okay, I can start now, I believe. Hello, and thank you for tuning in to part 2 of the emergency teach-in on genocide in Gaza. My name is Sherene Razack, and I'm a distinguished professor in the Penny Canner Endowed Chair in Gender Studies at UCLA. I'm the author of Nothing Has to Make Sense, Upholding White Supremacy Through Anti-Muslim Racism. I'm also the moderator of this event, which is sponsored by the Racial Violence Hub, which is a virtual network of scholars who write on racial violence. You'll find recordings of this webinar and resources on racialviolencehub.com. A little warning right at the beginning for those in the LA area at 10:19, there is an emergency drill, so all of your phones will sound and it'll be very disruptive. So it's a good idea to turn off your phones prior to that time. Let me begin then with the topic of today's webinar. Genocide must always be thinkable. Mahmoud Mamdani observed this when he sought to explain the Rwandan genocide in terms of Rwanda's colonial history, a talking back to the journalists who insisted that some primordial human instinct had somehow been responsible for the genocide, some evil lurking in human consciousness. Our analysis clearly cannot stop short at concepts like good and evil. We must be able to understand what roots take us to genocide and therefore how to stop it. It's hard for us at a time like this when we feel that we can only cry out in grief for all the lives lost and to cry out in terror for the merciless killing of Palestinians presently unfolding. But think we must, even as it is our impulse to cry out. I thought we would begin this webinar with a very brief poem by Muhammad Darwish, Think of Others. As you prepare your breakfast, think of others. Do not forget the pigeon's food. As you conduct your wars, think of others. Do not forget those who seek peace. As you pay your water bill, think of others, those who are nursed by clouds. As you return home to your home, think of others. Do not forget the people of the camps. As you liberate yourself in metaphor, think of others, those who have lost the right to speak. As you think of others far away, think of yourself. Say, if only I were a candle in the dark. We begin the webinar with a statement from our Palestinian colleagues in Palestine, read by Professor Lubna Khatami of Asian American Studies, UCLA.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Professor Sherene Razack, for that introduction and for grounding us in this discussion. I just want to start off by saying that I think holding this teach-in and holding all of the rallies and the protests and the vigils and the community spaces and the grief spaces that so many of us have been doing is a way to hold space for Palestine and the Palestinians as we are witnessing all of the forces of empire mobilizing and enabling a genocide committed against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. So I thank you all for being here, for holding this space with us and alongside Palestinians who are holding their ground and refusing to flee their homes despite the threats of murder that they are enduring and the actual real life active killing that is happening. As Professor Razack mentioned, I want to read a statement that was issued by Biele University in occupied Palestine, a call from our academic colleagues to academic institutions across the world. We at Biele University call upon international academic institutions to take concrete action to stop the genocidal war on the Palestinian people and to end Israeli settler colonialism. Over the past 8 days, this was issued a couple of days ago, Israel's brutal and vicious bombardment of the Gaza Strip, which has been besieged by Israel for the past 17 years, has resulted in the killing of over 2,400 Palestinians. As of this morning, the number is almost 4,500. 1/3 of whom are children, the injuring of over 10,000 Palestinians. Again, the numbers are much higher today. The deliberate displacement of more than 500,000 Palestinians and the call for the removal of another 1.1 million from the north of the Gaza Strip, the destruction of 60,000 residential units, in addition to targeted attacks on hospitals, schools, and universities. Recent statements by Israeli government officials calling Palestinians human animals that are to be starved and further made hostage through a complete blockade of food, water, electricity, and fuel amplifies Israel's founding racist ideology that operates with pervasive international impunity and complicity. This war of elimination began in 1948, and it continues to escalate, devoid of humane rules or ethical constraints, exacerbating an already insufferable living situation for Palestinians. Biele University calls upon the international academic community, unions, and students to fulfill their intellectual and academic duty of seeking truth, maintaining a critical distance from state-sponsored propaganda, and to hold the perpetrators of genocide and those complicit with them accountable. We hold Israeli universities responsible, as they have been indispensable to the regime of settler colonial oppression and apartheid, complicit in grave violations of human rights, including developing weaponry, military doctrines, and legal justification for the indiscriminate mass targeting of Palestinians. These academic institutions must be shunned by the international academic community. Biele University urges the international community to immediately intervene to stop this barbaric aggression and to protect Palestinians from dramatic escalation of Israeli war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing throughout all of Palestine. The ongoing impunity granted by the international community to the Israeli occupying forces must end today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Khatami. I now introduce the panelists for today. We will start with Professor Saree Makdisi, Professor of English and Comparative Literature at UCLA and author of Tolerance is a Wasteland, Palestine and the Culture of Denial. The second speaker will be Professor Segal, Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and Endowed Professor in the Study of Modern Genocide, Stockton University, author of the most recent article, A Textbook Case of Genocide. The final speaker will be Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, Professor and Lawrence D. Biele Chair in Law of the Institute of Criminology, Faculty of Law, and School of Social Work and Social Welfare at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She is also the chair in Global Law at Queen Mary University of London. She is the author of several books that are absolutely pertinent to the discussion, but the one I believe she will be centering today is Incarcerated Childhood, the Politics of Unchilding. So we'll begin with Professor Makdisi.
Thank you, Sherene. Thank you to everybody attending. To the statement from Biele that Professor Khatami read, there's not much that one can add. We could throw more numbers and so on, but I don't think that's at this point that's not really helpful. What I want to begin with is just some other ways of thinking about what's been happening in Gaza in recent days, without getting into more numbers about how many people have been killed and injured and hurt and so forth. I think to really appreciate what's happening, I think people really need to tune into the Arabic news media, and all the major Arabic channels have live YouTube accounts, basically. So you can, without even you don't even need to understand Arabic. You can just it's the video itself, because they have camera people all over Gaza, and so the raw footage that you get on in Al Jazeera or Mayadeen or any of these channels, just the footage, just seeing the scenes in the hospitals, for example, adds so much more humanity to what's unfolding these days. I want to, instead of trying to convey the humanity of the people in Gaza, which is of course an important task, I want to just talk about I want to begin with a few images, a few kind of concretizations, let's say, of what's been happening. And then I want to just talk about very briefly about, you know, where we are in terms of the various forms of denial at play about what's happening in the U.S. And then I'll conclude on with a few other thoughts about some of the mail I've been receiving since this catastrophe began 10 or 12 days ago. First image I want to have you think about, I want to put into your minds, is that of white phosphorus, which is a term, you know, that you read about it in you know, Amnesty International reports, and occasionally it comes up in the, you know, LA Times or the Guardian or the New York Times or whatever. But to say, just to use the term white phosphorus doesn't convey what white phosphorus actually is. So I want people who don't, for whatever reason, and you know, like, why would normal people know about what white phosphorus is? But I think it's important for people to know the way the Israelis use white phosphorus in Gaza, and they keep denying it, but you can see the video. I mean, white phosphorus is unmistakable when you see it, when you see footage of it. It's instantly identifiable as such. The Israelis use white phosphorus in 155 millimeter artillery shells that are designed to, they have what's called an airburst fuse. So they burst up in the air and then they shower downwards. And so the idea of doing that is to cover as wide an area as possible from above, so that there's basically nowhere you can hide. And it sends out a cone. You've seen it. They look like fingers coming down, but it's basically a cone of coverage that sends down these fragments of white phosphorus. Usually it's sort of felt pads embedded with white phosphorus. And white phosphorus was what's called pyrophoric. It burns on contact with air, and it will keep burning as long as there's air that it can contact. Which means that when it rains down on people, if it makes contact with a human being, it will burn all the way down into the bone, because as long as it's got air, it's going to keep burning. You can pour water on it, you can do all kinds of things. As long as it's got contact with air, white phosphorus keeps burning. So I want you to have that image of what it means for the Israeli state to be firing 155 millimeter airburst or airburst fused artillery shells over a very, I'm going to say very densely, it is the most densely packed area in the entire world. I ran the numbers the other day, and just to try and convey the population density of Gaza in terms that Americans can understand. If the United States had the population density of Gaza, instead of there being 300 odd million Americans, there would be 66 billion Americans. That's what we're talking about. So imagine taking a 17 square mile area packed with 2 million people, and then showering this, other than all the other huge explosions, with this white phosphorus raining down on people who have nowhere to hide. Just I want that to be in your heads, because it's an important facet of what's going on. The second thing I want to point out, and again, this is something that comes through, I've been kind of, as many of us are, watching the news and reading and so forth nonstop. And I want to just give you an image that came across in one of the reports from Jazeera Arabic, one of the many correspondents they have in Gaza, reporting live. And she was saying two things. And again, this does not come across in any of the Western media accounts that I've seen or read. Some of the bombs that the Israelis, other than the white phosphorus, some of the high explosive munitions that the Israelis are dropping on Gaza are 1,000 or 2,000 pound bombs. These are very, very, very heavy bombs. I mean, they can take down, and they do take down, entire buildings at a time, entire big concrete buildings at a time. Sometimes, and this is what she was saying in this report, and I want to share it with you so that I want you to have this in your heads too, because it's been haunting me now since I heard it a week ago. Sometimes the explosions are so big in Gaza, she says, that it's not just that the building is destroyed, and we are given in Western media accounts images of collapsed buildings. It doesn't tell you what's going on with the people in the buildings. Sometimes the explosions are so powerful that entire bodies, she said, particularly of children, because they tend to be small, like young children, are ejected from the exploding building and scattered over the whole neighborhood. Burned, charred bodies of children, and then of adults who are bigger and heavier than children, parts like torsos and legs and arms and heads and things like that, burned, scorched, torched, ejected. So I want you to imagine being in an area where entire buildings are being demolished. Last time I checked, the number is 1,700 entire buildings in Gaza had been destroyed by the big concrete multi-story apartment building had been destroyed. Imagine the level of destruction, and imagine the shower of body parts in entire neighborhoods. I want that image to be with you because that's what we're talking about here. And finally, this reporter also said, wherever you go in Gaza, you smell death. I mean, literally, it's in your nostrils, always. I want that to be in your heads. And finally, one last image. Whenever you hear any of the live coverage from Gaza, what you hear in the background every time, inevitably, is a dull that's the sound of Israeli drones. Wherever you go in the Gaza Strip, there are Israeli drones flying overhead. It is a constant sound. It is in every recording, every phone call, every TV report, everything coming out of Gaza are these drones buzzing overhead. Some of the drones the Israelis use for surveillance. Some of the drones are equipped with weapons and they fire at people and cars. The other day, a Hellfire missile was fired from an Israeli drone at an ambulance and destroyed the ambulance and killed the crew, burned them alive, in fact. And that noise of a drone, I want you to imagine being trapped in a territory where you hear this constant, incessant buzzing of drones over your head. And you know, especially in the darkness, any of those drones that you're hearing could have a missile that's going to come for you. I want you to imagine what it's like to live under those kinds of circumstances. Now I want to read a little bit from a piece I've been working on, and then don't worry, it's only about a page or so, it's not very long. And then I'm going to just conclude with a few more remarks. The specter of death is hanging over Gaza, warned Martin Griffiths, UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. This is last week. With no water, I'm quoting him here, with no water, no power, no food, no medicine, thousands will die. Plain and simple. That's Martin Griffiths. Last week, as I'm sure many of you know, the Israelis said that it would be best, on the whole, for the entire population of the Gaza Strip, over 2 million people, half of them children, to leave the territory, to get out. And they've said this over the years in various kinds of ways. Either, where are they going to go? Let them go to Egypt. One of them said, let them go to the Gulf. There's a lot of room in the Persian and the Arab Gulf. The Israeli analyst Giora Eiland said approvingly, and I'm quoting Giora Eiland here, we aim to create conditions where life in Gaza becomes unsustainable. As a result, Giora Eiland continues, and I'm quoting him again, Gaza will become a place where no human being can exist, unquote. We're talking about a place, 17 square miles, it's more than 2 million people, half of them children. He's saying no human being should be able to exist there. Major General Ghassan Alian of the Israeli army, echoing the defense minister's comments last week, that the defense minister said that Palestinians are human animals. This guy, this general of theirs, said, quote, human animals must be treated as such. There will be no electricity and no water in Gaza. There will be only destruction. What kind of people talk like this, with a godlike sense of their power over literally millions of people? What mindset produces such proclamations on the disposition of entire populations? What we are witnessing before our eyes is, I think, unprecedented in the history of colonial warfare. Ethnic cleansing is, in and of itself, not as unusual as one would like, unfortunately. Only a few weeks ago, as I'm sure you know, 130,000 Armenians were driven from their homes in Razack by Azerbaijan, which is not coincidentally armed by the Israelis. In the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, tens of thousands of people at a time of the wrong religion or ethnicity were expelled from their communities in Bosnia, Serbia, and Croatia. Almost all, 90%, of the Christian and Muslim population of Palestine itself was ethnically cleansed by Zionist forces in 1948. And of course, we can go back to the 19th, 18th, 17th, 16th centuries and so forth, and recall the sordid history of genocide, extermination, and slavery with which Western civilization made its enlightened presence felt all around the planet. But in no instance that I know of, and I've studied this, alas, has ethnic cleansing been accomplished through the use of massive ordnance and heavy bombardment with modern weapon systems, including the one-ton bombs and bunker buster munitions and white phosphorus and so forth, used by the Israelis. Such matters are normally conducted in person, with rifles or at the point of the bayonet. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948 was carried out entirely, basically, with small arms, for instance. People were massacred, with rifles and pistols and machine guns, not by having one-ton bombs dropped on them. What we are witnessing, in other words, is a strange and kind of mutation, if you want, of a kind of an attitude that comes from old school, like 17th or 18th century colonialism, but with 21st century weapons. As far as I know, is if not unprecedented, certainly very unusual. What's worse than this attitude, I think, if anything could be worse, what's worse is the nearly total indifference on display by so many in and out of government in the Western world. Given the shock and outrage over the Palestinian massacre of Israeli civilians expressed by journalists, politicians, governments, and university presidents, including some nearby, the nearly blanket silence concerning the fate of Palestinian civilians at the hands of the Israeli state is deafening. Here's the huge difference, though. I mean, I personally care about all civilian life, but the biggest fundamental difference, other than the scale of the violence and that who's perpetrating whom, and one is a colonizing power and one is an oppressed people and all that kind of thing, which we can get into. So there are all forms of gradation that we can get into, but the biggest difference, as far as we in the West are concerned, is this singular fact, which I think we need to entertain and think about much more seriously than we tend to. We can oppose killing of Israeli civilians, but we do not pay for the killing of Israeli civilians. We do not support it. We do not finance it. Our government does not aid and abet it. But when it comes to the Israeli killing of Palestinian civilians, our government not only supports it, it pays for it, it finances it, it provides weapons and resupplies of weapons and resupplies of weapons, and so on. The artillery shells that I was telling you about, the airburst phosphorus shells, those are supplied to the Israelis by the US government. Those are our tax dollars at work. We pay for it, which is to say we are complicit as Western citizens in what our governments are doing, supplying, aiding, abetting, and financing. That's the big difference between the Palestinian violence on Israeli civilians and Israeli violence on Palestinian civilians. We're paying for the latter, not for the former. We're supporting it. Our elected officials are running around saying how wonderful it is and how it should go on indefinitely. When the United Nations Security Council was debating a resolution that was, the resolution was calling for a ceasefire and the provision of humanitarian aid to the population of Gaza, the Gaza Strip. Guess what country, I know this is going to be hard for you to imagine, guess what country vetoed that resolution? A resolution calling for a ceasefire and the provision of humanitarian aid. Yeah, it was the United States. We are complicit in what's happening. This must be reckoned with, I think. There's one or two more things I want to say, then I'll stop because I've probably gone on too long already. Two quick points. When the White House spokesperson, Catherine Jean-Pierre, was asked about certain progressive, more or less progressive Congress people who were calling for a ceasefire in the US House of Representatives, and she was told, well, what do you think of these Congress people saying there should be a ceasefire? She said, and I quote, she said, "We believe they're wrong. We believe they're repugnant. We believe they're disgraceful. There are not two sides here. There are not two sides." In other words, calling for a ceasefire is disgraceful and repugnant. I mean, I ask you, what kind of country says that in an official capacity? The last thing I want to say is just a very, very quick reflection on some of the hate mail I've been receiving over the past 10 or 12 days. I'm used to hate mail. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't worry me. It doesn't do anything to me other than sort of fascinate me, because I always want to get into the heads of these people who send these messages. And the overwhelming range of messages I've been getting has been, first of all, how can you, meaning me, support Hamas terrorism? How can you condone the killing of children and this kind of thing, and so on? A lot of which I've done, and that's not what I find fascinating in all of this kind. And it's not just the hate mail that I get. It's like it's out there in the media, it's out there in public commentary, it's out there in social media, and so forth. What I find fascinating is this, all of the attention and emotional energy being attached to Israeli civilian victims of Palestinian violence, and the extent to which that focus, that obsession, that myopic attention that's being given to the Israeli victims of Palestinian violence is being used to occlude, to cover up, to overshadow the far greater, as we've already said, Israeli violence being directed at the entire, in this case, not just the population of the Gaza Strip, by the way, because even as we speak today, the Israelis are killing people in the West Bank, they're killing people in elsewhere in Palestine, they're killing people in Lebanon. It's not just Gaza is the worst place, but it's not just Gaza. And so in my last book, which is called Tolerance is a Wasteland, Palestine and the Culture of Denial, I talk about the various mechanisms of denial that supporters of the Israeli state in the West in general, the US in particular, the kind of mindset that they're able to develop in order to be able to somehow reconcile their understanding of themselves as people who believe in human rights and equality and democracy and all those kinds of things with their support for a state that represents the exact antithesis of all those kinds of values, as we can see before our very eyes. And that's why the hate mail fascinates me, because I want to know how is it? What is it about you that you're not able to see what I'm seeing? And one of the mechanisms, I'm not going to give you a whole lecture about the book, but one of the mechanisms that comes up in the book repeatedly is this mechanism of occlusion. Don't look at that, look at this. And in the book, it tends to work in terms of the affirmation of various positive values like tolerance and democracy and this kind of thing. But in what we're seeing in Gaza right now, this that they want us to focus on obsessively is the harm done to Israeli civilians. And what that obsessive regard is, that obsessive regard occludes and covers up, as I said, the far greater, massive damage being inflicted on the Palestinians in Gaza. So what we see here, in other words, is another mechanism of denial, which is how I think we have to understand. I mean, I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I think these are the terms in which we need to understand how it is that these people can simply not see what we're seeing, and how they cannot be driven to madness by their own, willy-nilly, their complicity in the violence being unleashed on Gaza. Thank you.
Sherene, you're on mute right now.
Sherene, you're muted.
Honest to God, it keeps on. Thank you very much, Professor Makdisi. That's a lot to reflect on. We will now turn to Professor Segal.
Thank you. I want to speak following what we just heard. I'll focus on one issue I think that might help us explain or think about why what we're seeing is so unprecedented, and what drives this sort of denial that we're experiencing. So U.S. President Joe Biden began his remarks in Israel yesterday with this, quote, "Hamas committed atrocities that recall the worst ravages of ISIS, unleashing pure, unadulterated evil upon the world. There is no rationalizing it, no excusing it, period. The brutality we saw would have cut deep anywhere in the world, but it cuts deeper here in Israel. October 7th, which was a sacred Jewish holiday, became the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. It has brought to the surface painful memories and scars left by a millennia of anti-Semitism and the genocide of the Jewish people. The world watched then, it knew, and the world did nothing. We will not stand by and do nothing again. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." End of quote. With this, Biden reinforced the deadly rhetoric that former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett expressed in typical unashamed terms in an interview on Sky News on 12th of October, where he said, quote, "We're fighting Nazis." This is a deep fantasy in Israeli politics and society. A powerful state with a powerful army, backed by powerful allies, is portrayed as powerless Jews in a struggle against Nazis, rather than attacking stateless Palestinians under Israeli settler colonial rule, military occupation, and siege for decades. This weaponization of Holocaust memory by Israeli politicians runs deep. In 1982, for instance, in the context of Israel's attack on Lebanon, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin compared Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat in Beirut to Adolf Hitler in his bunker in Berlin at the end of World War II. 3 decades later, in October 2015, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu took this weaponization to new levels when he asserted in a speech in the World Jewish Congress in Jerusalem that the Palestinian Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini planted the idea to murder Jews in Hitler's mind. And 2 days ago, Netanyahu described Hamas in a press conference together with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz as, quote, the new Nazis. I argued in my article last Friday that what we are witnessing unfolding in front of our eyes is, quote, a textbook case of genocide, primarily because of the explicit proclamations by Israeli leaders and army officers, as we've heard, conveying, quote, the intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza as such, to quote from the language of the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, that is, collectively as a group, not just individuals. The fantasy of, quote, fighting Nazis drives such explicit language. That's why we're seeing it. It's very rare that perpetrators of genocide express themselves in such unashamed and direct ways. And that's because the image of Nazis is one of pure, unadulterated evil, to quote Biden, which removes all laws and restrictions in the fight against it. No law applies. This is a deeply dehumanizing discourse, evil. It is the epitome of a genocidal discourse, because perpetrators of genocide indeed see their victims as evil and themselves as righteous. This is how the Nazis saw Jews. Biden's words constitute, therefore, a textbook use of the Holocaust, not in order to stand with a powerless people facing genocidal violence, the historical reality of the Holocaust, and the reality now in front of our eyes, but to support and justify a genocidal attack of a powerful state against them, while also distorting this reality. But the reality in front of our eyes, and it is horrific and clear. Since the start of the mass violence on 7th of October 2023, the number of Palestinians killed in Gaza, as we've heard, has surpassed 4,500, including at least 1,500 children, thousands of people injured, and about 1 million people displaced. There's also a horrible escalation of violence against Palestinians under Israeli occupation in the West Bank, including killings and an intensification of an already horrible process of ethnic cleansing there, and against Palestinian citizens of Israel. There is no Hamas in the West Bank, but as in all murderous fantasies, the reality that we can all see means little for Israelis now fighting in their minds Nazis. Leaders in the West recently used the term evil to refer to another case of mass violence, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. Carl Bildt, co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations, tweeted on 1st of March that Putin is leading, quote, an empire of evil. And the same day, Anne Applebaum also wrote about Putin and evil. Unlike in the case of Palestinians, however, this was a very new discourse in relation to Putin. And it's worthwhile for us to explore this just in a couple of minutes. For just 2 years earlier, on 24th of January 2020, Putin was in fact invited to speak at the 5th World Holocaust Forum at Yad Vashem, the main Holocaust memorial site and research center of Israel in Jerusalem, to mark 70 years of the liberation of the Nazi death camp at Auschwitz by Soviet forces in January 1945. In his speech, Putin presented a completely distorted history of World War II and the Holocaust, including distorted maps, to fit a Russian narrative that erased the Nazi-Soviet alliance in the destruction of Poland in 1939 and presented Ukrainians, Latvians, and Lithuanians primarily as Nazi collaborators. Putin used precisely this weaponization of Holocaust history when he launched his assault on Ukraine in February 2022, as we all remember, explaining it as a campaign of, quote, denazification. Explicit and unashamed, just like Bennett. Putin thus used the Holocaust to create a world turned upside down. Ukrainians facing a brutal and unprovoked Russian attack became Nazis. When leaders in the West turned powerful Israelis to powerless Jews and powerless Palestinians to Nazis, they are moving in Putin's world. The history of the Holocaust, by contrast, reminds us to center the voices and perspectives of those facing state violence and genocide. The most urgent thing that Palestinians in Gaza now need is a ceasefire and an end to the Israeli bombing campaign. This is also what at least some of the Israeli survivors of the Hamas attack on 7th of October and family members of Israeli civilians in captivity in Gaza also want. Stopping the unfolding violence, saving lives, and the release of Israeli hostages together with the many Palestinian civilians unlawfully detained by Israel for many, many years should be a top priority now. The history of the Holocaust also suggests that accountability is significant, even as post-Holocaust accountability remained limited and unfolded in quite problematic ways. In the case of Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, accountability, in my view, needs to begin from what is very clear: incitement to genocide, which is punishable under Article 3 of the UN Genocide Convention, even when genocide does not follow. It will also be important that Israeli perpetrators of war crimes and those responsible for violations of international humanitarian law in the many years of the siege on Gaza, including during this current assault, will stand trial. Palestinian leaders and Palestinians who perpetrated the mass atrocities on 7th of October should also be held accountable. International courts and legal processes are important also because they often become a space, however limited, for survivors to tell their stories, assert their humanity, and demand justice that is based on the truth. No value related to the study of the Holocaust and its memory are perhaps more central than truth. No justice is possible, not in the short term and certainly not in the long term, without a truthful reckoning of how we got here. That is the long history of Israeli settler colonial violence against Palestinians, from the Nakba through military occupation, apartheid policies, and the siege of Gaza. A long history that includes many well-documented crimes under international law, and now, I argue, also genocide. The world is indeed watching, as Biden said, and it knows, despite Biden's use of the Holocaust to distort what is clearly in front of our eyes. As more than 800 scholars of international law, conflict studies, and Holocaust and genocide studies said in a statement on 15th of October, and I quote, "We are compelled to sound the alarm about the possibility of the crime of genocide being perpetrated by Israeli forces against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. We do not do so lightly, recognizing the weight of this crime, but the gravity of the current situation demands it." Many Holocaust and genocide study scholars, including Jewish Holocaust and genocide study scholars, including myself, have added their names to the statement. This is significant. If Israel and its supporters have used the Holocaust to establish Israeli impunity, this exceptional status, so that the many well-documented crimes under international law, the many truth in front of our eyes could be distorted, denied, rationalized, justified, then these days we are seeing a shift. More and more Holocaust and genocide study scholars are now refusing to allow this dangerous falsification to continue. This provides some hope in this horrible darkness, as it supports the Palestinian struggle for justice and freedom, and it supports the struggle for a different future for all the people who live between the river and the sea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Segal. We will now turn to Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, coming to us from Jerusalem.
Yes. Good morning to you. Good evening here. It's not easy to speak at this time amidst the attacks and the genocide in Gaza. So as I usually do in my work, I want to really center the voices of those facing genocide and state violence, facing states' genocidal intent, as Raz was saying, rhetoric, actions, or what Saree was talking about, the global and local political positions and complicity. To do so, let me start with Ahmed from Gaza, that I interviewed him for my study on kids that participated in the demonstrations on the March of Return in 2019. And he was shot in his knees and he's unable to walk and debilitated him. And I told him, why were you shot? He said that they are killers of hope. This is why I was shot. They are killers of hope. So Palestinian children are really unchilded. They're not considered children, as I say. And hence they're feared, not perceived as those who have the right to resist or to continuous indignity, trauma, and unending violence. But it was Haya and her letter that I really wanted to share with you, that she's she's one of those that were killed in Gaza, and this is a letter, a will, Haya's will. She wrote it in her own hand, and she said, "Hello, my name is Haya, and I will write my will now. My money, 45 shekels for my mother, 5 for Zaina, 5 for Hashem, 5 for my grandma, 5 for Auntie Hiba, and 5 for Aunt Miriam, 5 for Uncle Abdu and Auntie Sarah. My toys and all my stuff for my friends, Zaina, my sister, Dima, Mina, and Amal. My clothes to my uncle, daughter, and if there is anything left, donate them. And my shoes, donate them to the poor and vulnerable. After washing it, of course. Yeah, after washing it, of course. And then the voice of a mother who was captured by Al Jazeera yesterday, and she was screaming, "L'awlad wainhen? Where are the kids? Hada yطمني? Someone tell me, please. بكفي يا عالم, enough people, enough. The kids died without eating." Or صار عنا عجز في الأكفان, قطعة قماش تستر أجسادنا. We have a shortage in coffins, a piece of cloth to cover our bodies. Mortuary's refrigerator can't hold the dead. So this is what we see in Gaza. And of course, the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, showed how many Palestinian casualties in Gaza. This is the number you can see, the West Bank and Israeli casualties. What I'm trying to tell you is that, and what I see, is that when you look at the situation there, the gun to body, the mundane, the day-to-day suffering, the no hope, the no rights, the no ability to plan a future, and the unending killing, the forced expulsion today, the children's death, and then you come and hear the Israeli discourse where Daniela Gari is saying the emphasis on damage, not accuracy. So they don't care if it's accurate, if it's hitting children, if it's hitting the hospital. Sorry, they don't care. It's just we do not count. So when we look at the data in Gaza alone, about 2/3 of the population are registered as refugees. Yes, this is the statistics. And about almost 50% are registered in camps. And the attacks on the camps are clear, yeah? And they are receiving, of course, we're receiving humanitarian aid from the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency. And Israel has said it used so far over 6,000 bombs in the first 6 days of the conflict, more than the US used in a year during its operation in Afghanistan, and double of what the US-led coalition used against Islamic State in Iraq and Syria in a month. And one of the most densely populated places on earth, where over 50% of the population are children. But this is not new, yeah? Because the question is it a genocide or not? How, where, and in what way, yeah? And when you look at what is going on in Gaza, I'm just thinking about my latest book on Unchilding. I started the chapter on Gaza talking about a group of mobs, an Israeli group of mobs in Tel Aviv, waving Israeli flags, encouraging their state to continue bombarding Gaza while chanting, and I'm quoting the chant that was reported. In Gaza, there is no studying, no children are left there. There is no school tomorrow, there's no children left in Gaza. Gaza is a graveyard. So Gaza is a graveyard was the plan, and Gaza and what is going on here is revealing that, as my friend told me yesterday, that his shoulder became a graveyard. So Gaza is under blockage, the siege, the state of siege, you see it, that began in 2007, increased the suffering, increased the suffocation. In 2007, a decision by the Israeli Security Cabinet stated that Israel would begin limiting the entry of goods, the entry of food in the Gaza Strip. I remember the report that we, as Gisha, an Israeli human rights organization, and I was part of the administration at that time, looked at the control over food, the control over trucks, and then they were putting Gaza on diet. Yeah, this was where they said that only a specific amount of calories are counted per person. Yeah, and we see that very strongly in Gaza. So Gaza is under blockage. Gaza is under siege in the longest in the modern history, and it's unlawful further tightened, and then water, electricity, food, and bombardment unleashed over 2.2 million, where over 50% are children. Another point that is very important, that not only the siege, it's that dangerous, dehumanizing, genocidal language. And as Raz was explaining, and Saree, the language, the naming is very important in genocide. Human animals, the genocidal language calling for a second Nakba, human animals, imposing what Gallant said, complete siege, which is total suffocation. Yeah, what Ben-Gvir said in his tweet on 2 days ago, in October 17, and I'm quoting: as long as Hamas does not release the hostages in its hands, the only thing that needs to enter Gaza are hundreds of tons of explosive from Air Force, not 1 ounce of humanitarian aid. So incitements create more and more hatred. Naftali Bennett, you mentioned him, Raz. Are you serious asking about Palestinian civilians? This is what he said. He was talking to the reporter on Sky News. We are fighting Nazis. So this decontextualized, ahistoricized, demonizing language enhances the fantasies of fighting Nazis. Then everything is permissible. Everything is permissible. It tells us that Palestinians do not have the right to survive, and hence Palestinians are expected, and I'm saying it clearly because it's very painful what goes on, expected to die. Now they can die in a large number on camera, yeah? And let me remind everyone that the worst atrocities that happened in human history, slavery, genocides against indigenous population, the genocide, the Armenian genocide in 1914, against the Jews during the Holocaust, they were all possible because of the dehumanization of an entire group of people, because of race, because of ethnicity, because of nationality, because of religion, through consistent propaganda against a group of people. This racialized language justifies genocide, saying these people are no people. Yeah. So think about what you are saying in social media. Think about it because it's very important. Now, the third point is the historic trajectory. So if we have siege, we have the language that is genocidal. The historic trajectory, it's a historical situation between a settler colonial movement, and settler colonialism is genocidal. Yeah, we know that very well. And anti-colonial movement against the ongoing Nakba is what Palestinians are doing. So the settler colonial logic and acts are always been embedded in a logic of elimination. And what we see today when Israel is pushing over 1 million Palestinians to move them somewhere, مش مهم, to Sinai, to hell, they don't care. It's a mass displacement. And this is ongoing since before 1947, where 750,000 Palestinians were displaced and never allowed to come back. In 1967, where 350,000 Palestinians never came back. And it continues, yeah? It continues. So no discussion can start without the historic trajectory. And the history of the present, yeah, Israel in the last years elected a government that talks about ethnic cleansing openly. So this is part of the context. Gaza since 2020, according to the United Nations, was clearly, was a non-sustainable place. This is what we've heard. These were the report. And then the recent history that kept on demonizing and dehumanizing and looking at Palestinians as ontologically different, as ontologically others, yeah? As I say in my work, when you look at Gaza in 2007, what happened in 2007, you say, well, it started in 2007. No, it did not start in 2007. These were, the refugee, descendants of refugee, and it's not a Gazan issue, rather, it's an Israeli issue. Israel created the situation. No other place in the modern world, a comprehensive air, sea, and land blockage. This is what we see. And Gaza remains an occupied territory, even if Israel's boots are not on the ground. Another point that is important is the refusal to draw a distinction between combatant and civilians. No civilians. This is what we hear today from the Israeli politicians, from Israeli journalists, from Israeli professors. No civilians, no children. This should raise the alarm bell. To where and why? Why this ontological racialization of Palestinians? The ongoing eliminatory and dispossessive policies, this turning a blind eye to the Palestinian suffering is also always paining and really agonizing me. The timing and the reason for Hamas atrocities attack parallel those to the outbreak of the first Intifada. It was an extreme marginalization, abandonment, a host of factors were there, yes, including the ultra-right Israeli government now apparent in the intention to annex the West Bank. You cannot separate the West Bank and Jerusalem from what is happening today in Gaza. West Bank settlers are increasingly assaulting Palestinians. The continued desecration of Islamic and Christian holy sites, the attacks and dispossession and housing demolitions and settlements in Jerusalem, and the sequence of accomplishing this peace agreements with the Gulf countries that is always also adding to the very unfair conditions to Palestinians. So add all the above to the dire living conditions in Gaza, the massive rates of poverty, the unemployment, the real almost complete absence of water, the disparity in adequate medical treatment. Look what happened yesterday. Tons of food and medicine is waiting for Israel to approve its crossing. And this medicine, those big trucks that are holding medicine for people that are dying, might be thrown in the trash. But it requires the approval of Israel. An additional point is Israel systematically undermining Gaza's economic development, what Sarah Roy called the de-development, which is another topic. One more topic is the eliminatory collective punishment, the ethnic cleansing, pushing Gaza out. And then we come to the false story, which is another point that I want to point, the false stories. And by the way, governments lie. and powerful governments' lies travels very fast. And all of a sudden, the entire world is really accepting them, yeah? Because they have more power and they have more effective weight. And I really want to talk about the effective weight in my last point. You know, fear and effective politics is crucial to understanding why it's happening now in front of all the cameras and the media and openly, and people are still accepting and going to sleep and not stopping their governments, not stopping Biden to come here. I was begging my daughter, can you find a way, Mama, not for him not to come here, not to allow them, because complicity, and Raz can tell us, complicity is one of the ways to be, because the US is complicit with this genocide. And then this production of fear and the effective politics and these strategies won't be done, mobilized, or activated without fear. So racialized fear, Islamophobia, mobilizing every racial trope, creating a common sense that war is inevitable, as if only by violence and by military solutions we can address violence. And I tell you, no military solution to this situation, no military solution. 7 million Palestinians, 7 million Jews, and we're not going anywhere, both of us. So what are we going to do? Israel acts also above the law. It's not operating within the confines of international law, and no accountability, as we've heard. So what I'm saying is that international law is meant to be particularly used when people's blood is boiling, which means now, and it's not used. Yeah. And my final point is the media. The media, the world is watching, said Biden. Yeah, the world is watching. But the problem is who counts and who doesn't count. No humanitarian corridors for Gaza. We are all accepting this genocide and this untenable situation where the story is about genocidal settler colonialism. The story is about land, food, water, life, shrinking land, shrinking bodies, demographic engineering, yeah? Yet the world is watching. And the failure of the UN system, and it's a decade of political failure, yeah, that became, that we see. So that global complicity, when Israel has even the monopoly, not only over conducting a genocide and then using self-defense, which is like, I don't understand, like I am failing to understand it. So we are in this spiraling, we are really spiraling into the abyss. And I'm kind of wondering, what are we going to do with this situation where Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitti, who is in Gaza, or my friends there, or losing people in Gaza, are being done and undone without even questioning. It is a genocide, and we cannot stop saying it. We need to continue saying what is happening is genocide. So where do we start narrating and how do we continue is a major question. But the main question today is to call, to scream, and to say this Zionist project is genocidal. This Zionist project should stop. When what we see today in Gaza against the people, as Muhammad, as Ahmed said, they're killers of hope. And I really hope that you won't be complicit with killing the future of those kids, because enough. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Shalhoub-Kevorkian. We have traversed a journey from white phosphorus to fantasies, racial fantasies, to Palestinians are not a people. I wonder if I could invite Professor Lubna Khatami to add to the discussion if she has points to make.
I don't really have very much to say, and I'm really appreciative to all of our panelists for moving us, for reminding us of what we already know, for giving us a vocabulary to articulate the depths of grief we've been experiencing, not just this week, but over the course of, what Palestinians have been experiencing over the course of the last century. I think the one point that I would just, emphasize, which has already been made, is really the way in which we really need to understand the United States is not just standing by idle. It is actively participating, sending boots on the ground, doubling down, vetoing the UN resolution that was proposed yesterday, and actively trying to prohibit a ceasefire, actively calling for genocide in Gaza. And I think that this kind of fear-mongering and the anti-Arab racism, anti-Palestinian racism, Islamophobia that is undergirding it is very reminiscent of the kind of lies and propaganda that were setting a foundation for a long time for the genocide in Rwanda. I think, Raz, when he spoke about the length of this siege that preempts this week being 17 years long, I mean, people were in complete crisis mode when we were watching the 4-year siege in Srebrenica, in Sarajevo, in Bosnia. I think that there is an exceptionalism that has been afforded to Zionism for far too long. It is not that Palestinians are exceptional. We have grieved and mourned and endured oppression and violence, just as all colonized people have. What is exceptional is the way in which there is a green light that continues to be passed to the Zionist project. And what is exceptional is the way in which the extreme forms, I don't even know if this word is proper, but the extreme forms of gaslighting that happens when we call out structures of power and violence, and how, as was already mentioned, Palestinians and their co-strugglers are constantly barraged and accused of anti-Semitism and terrorism when we are calling for freedom, justice, and rights. At the end of the day, I just want to emphasize Palestinians and Israelis are not fighting for the same reasons. Palestinians are fighting for their freedom and for their rights and for life. They understand colonization as a death-making project. They understand what has been happening to them long before this week as genocidal. And Israelis are fighting to annex Palestinian land without the Palestinians, whether they are intentional about it or aware of it or not. To annex land without a specific demographic necessitates a genocide. And so this is what we really need to emphasize, that if we want this cycle of violence to stop, if we want to stop hearing in the news every 3 years of a massive offensive on Gaza, of a massive war, of another uprising in the West Bank and in 1948 Palestine, we have to understand the genocidal logics that undergird the Zionist ideology and the Zionist project from the onset of conquest, long before the Nakba. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Khatami, for that very powerful statement. I would like to invite the panelists if they have questions of each other or points they wish to raise. Yes, Saree.
I mean, I think we're all in agreement, but what I don't understand, I mean, there's my way of trying to explain it to, principally to myself, what I said, this business of occlusion, so that, the people who support Israeli policies in the US, they're always drawing our attention to something else instead of looking at, what's happening to Palestinians. So there's the one overshadows the other. And obviously, at least part of what's happening right now involves that kind of occlusion. But the scale we're talking about, and Professor Segal is, I'm not, a scholar of genocide per se. I studied colonialism, but not genocide as such. But I mean, clearly from what I gather in terms of genocide conventions and so forth, what's happening clearly is, certainly the language being used is genocidal language, there's no doubt about that. And then I would assume that it meets the legal definition of genocide or intent to genocide, this kind of thing, clearly. So I guess my question is to my colleagues on the panel, what are the mechanisms that prevent that, other than the thing about occlusion that I've talked about, but what are the mechanisms that prevent people here in the US from getting it? What is it? And I'll just throw out one suggestion, but it's only one. I have by no means have all the answers. But one of the things, like for example, this language about the Israeli defense minister saying Palestinians are human animals, or the lines that Nadera was quoting and so forth. Like these lines, which are clearly not just monstrous, they are, I mean, clinically genocidal. I mean, in absolutely clinical terms, there's no question about that. Why those lines? I don't think they get through to an American audience, for example. I don't think people hear those lines. They're filtered out at some point, I assume, by the media. But then is it the media? Are they saying, "Oh, we can't say that," or we're going to? I'm just wondering what people think about the mechanisms by which people here in the U.S. or Canada or North America or Europe or wherever are stopped from being able to acknowledge this for what it actually is. Yeah, that's my question to my colleagues.
Saree, one of the lines that usually I use to explain this fear of acknowledging. I'm just thinking about me as a person whose parents survived the Nakba, and the family survived the Armenian genocide. And there's something about this denial, this fear of acknowledging or seeing the other. And it reminds me really of one of the, Sherene started with Mahmoud Darwish, but it reminds me of one of his poems where he talks about how the killer looks at I wish I can find it for you, but it's in criminology we say criminals are always afraid. They are afraid. They're afraid to talk about what they're doing. They cannot look at their criminality. And the problem is that the moment you start talking about it, you can open the hearts, you can open the minds. And I can tell you that it's easier to speak to people here, to my students, than to speak in the US. And this is another thing that puzzles me, because I am at an Israeli institution, and this is my home, my academic home. And when I talk about the Nakba, when I talk about occupation, when I talk about the effect of militarization and weaponization, with time, they are willing to listen. The problem is that the US is so blind that this is where I'm kind of, I remember Sherene's work when she talks about how while Aboriginal bodies hunt the settlers, yeah, it also reminds them, it's a reminder of that the land is indeed stolen. This is one of your lines, Sherene. So that language is there, and that language of hatred and so on. So I don't know whether I'm making sense to you, but one of it is fear, and fear of acknowledging that you have caused pain to others. And it requires really working harder. And maybe it's us that we need to work harder. The issue is that when I'm looking at the list of, and today I just looked at the massacres that we went through. From as a child, Tantura was close to my house, and my dad always took me there to swim with my siblings. And the first thing he said, when you step there, just do like this, because people are buried before you start swimming. And this is the Tantura. It took so many years for the Tantura massacre to be eaten. And then I'm thinking about myself being in Jenin camp, where the smell of death was strong. When, talking about the lead, the Dawaimi, the baby, the Kfr Qasim, Qalqilia, thinking about those massacres, I'm wondering, how come the world is still turning a blind eye to this eliminatory, genocidal, not only logic, but rather acts of the Israeli government, where with this particular government, it's open. They're saying it, they're speaking it in the Knesset. So it is very open. So why? It is fear. It's psychological. They need to deal with it psychologically, but it's more than that. It's also because they can. because the international community is really supporting it, because the US is allowing it. When you are allowed and you're not held responsible and you're not going to court, it's clear that you can do it. Why not?
Anyone else to add? Raz?
Yeah, very briefly, I mentioned that I think there's I think that the force of the Holocaust as an identity issue in the West is very powerful, and it involves many things. It involves, for example, the conflation of two very different things: a state and a people, Jews and Israel, right? Which allows this this distortion of reality, right? Of a powerful state into powerless people, Israelis, Jews, and I think that this is rooted in itself also in a yet a broader context. And we don't have time to get into any of this in detail, but it's important to mention that, of course, after the Holocaust, rather than work to create a different political system in the world, right? What happened is the reinforcement of the political system that was part of the problem, in this case specifically the nation state system, right? So the idea that that a Jewish state, right, an exclusionary Jewish state becomes the quote unquote solution to the Jewish problem, right? Which reinforces then, of course, the idea of eliminating Jews from societies where they had lived for generations, right? For generations and generations. And some of them went, continued to exist and continue to exist until today in Europe. So there's a broader context of the post-Holocaust world. There's a specific context of how it's embedded in ideas about Israel and ideas about Jews that then reinforce this idea of exceptionalism about the Holocaust, exceptionalism about Jews, exceptionalism about Israel as a Jewish state. I do want, and again, there's so much more to say about all of this, but I do want to say and emphasize that the field that I'm working within, and Holocaust and genocide studies, which is, I have to say, part of the problem here, but it's changing. We see because of what we're seeing now in explicit ways in front of our eyes in such shocking terms and language, there is definitely a change. We see this in the statement from which I quoted from. I see this. I've been receiving a lot of hate mails in the last few days, as you said, Saree. But I have to say, I've been receiving far, far, far more without even a comparison support from Holocaust and genocide scholars, from Jews around the world, from Jews who write to me, specifically identifying themselves as daughters and as children of Holocaust survivors or grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, so writing from this perspective, right? So I think there is a shift, and it's very important because, as I said, I think this shift goes to the heart of challenging this exceptional status that Israel has, this impunity, and how that might manifest itself politically, or even in the immediate term of stopping the violence as fast as possible, right? I don't know. But I think that this shift is significant. And I think that, again, it gives some very little hope, perhaps, but some hope in this very horrific days.
I think this conversation is moving in the direction of some comments expressed in the Q&A. I want to just maybe pose them on behalf of people from the Q&A. We have been talking, I think, without exactly using the phrase, something about the colonizer's psyche and how it comes to be that people are so easily finding themselves on this genocidal landscape and in agreement with it. So I think we're talking about that. One of the questions in the chat that maybe expresses this in connection with Nadera's presentation is, how do we get to a new ontology? How do we get to a new valuing of Palestinian life? And that question seems to take us in the direction that you've been all going, Saree, with your notion of denial, and Nadera with the idea of what is feared, the idea that what you fear is that you have done wrong, that you have stolen land, that you have killed, and that you are killing. And that idea must be repressed. We perhaps really do need the psychoanalysts into this discussion. But I wonder if we want, you've talked, Raz, also, and Saree, about the power of this ontology, the fact that our hate mail, repeatedly sort of expresses this. One problem that I personally have with all of this is that as a scholar, I am very seduced by the scholarly liberal imagination that if I tell you all the facts on the ground, you will change your mind, you will understand. And to some extent, we are all doing that because we must. Saree, when you talked about white phosphorus, or we talked about how children are understood to be, animals, we believe, all of us, and we must believe that if we tell you about it, things will change. I think there's a sort of middle step that maybe we want to think about in terms of what is it that we are confronting. It's not simply a lack of information. It is not simply what people don't know. It is also what they do know and how they are constructed themselves. And so it is a kind of challenge for us as scholars to move into that direction and to try and not be utterly stopped in our tracks when we get the kind of mail. I mean, I get mail, I'm sure you all get mail. They ask things like, I don't understand why you don't understand that Jews are the indigenous people of Palestine. You get these kinds of statements that really point to the edges of the fantasy that is fueling this support for so much killing and violence. So I wonder if you want to comment a bit more on this. Nadera.
Yeah, let me first say that we must always keep in mind that we can offer information. I can go over, there was a question, okay, tell us about the Genocide Convention, what Article 2 is saying, it's that the intent to destroy in whole or in part national, ethnic, racial, and religious group, and Raz can go on. But the question is not only numbers and knowledge, because numbers lie. And the issue is power. The issue is support. Israel can because it's supported. Israel can because of its leadership. Israel can because of Netanyahu today. Israel can because they're using the Bible, what I call in my book, sacralization of politics. Israel can because security became a theology. So numbers are important, facts are important, but when there is power produces different knowledge. Power produces and you put a different, you puzzle it differently. And 1 + 1 becomes 313 and minus 17 and so on. So let's not say as scholars, because you can put million numbers and prove and come and talk. And believe me, you can reach the hearts of people. Of course, today in Israel, everybody is upset. Their hearts are boiling. Everybody is agonized. We Palestinians are barely sleeping, can't handle the amount of information moving from one channel to the other. And I see the animalization of the Palestinian on Israeli channels. I hear it from people that I never, ever expected to hear it from. Yeah, because they were all wearing this liberal anti-Zionist quote. And I don't know, Raz, you're saying, no, some people are more open and are more supportive of what you have said or what I'm saying. I see the opposite totally. I see universities today taking us to court. I see a university professor from the Technion that all she wrote on her Facebook is the victory is only to God, a phrase from the Quran, and she was in 3 days and under arrest, and now she was released. I see the threats on our students. God knows what will happen to me in a day or two. I might also end up in prison just by talking about what I'm saying. And the university, it's about power. It's about power because they can. And the question is, how can we ask the people? Because we see the people of the world are in the streets. It's the leadership and its power. So how can we really unpack this power that is violating, that is coding, that are part of the complicity in genocide?
Saree.
That's a very powerful point. And so I want to speak to it. Raz sort of raised it in passing towards the end of his comments a few minutes ago too. What the hate mail, I get, it's true that I get, fan mail too, but there's a lot of hate mail. So it's the hate mail that I find, I mean, I appreciate the family, but the hate mail I think is interesting for all the reasons that we've been saying, like what is going on in somebody's head when they say things like this, because it is fascinating. It's like looking at something in a petri dish and you want to know what's going on inside this person's head, because that, But however, I think this is a super important point. And so I don't want to give a lecture about my book, but in a nutshell, the argument of my book is that various mechanisms of denial, particularly for liberal constituencies in the US and in the Western world in general, they worked for decades, basically. They worked, basically up until very recent history, meaning like really the 2000s, 1990s and 2000s, really. And that more and more people just don't buy these mechanisms of denial anymore. So we have to be very careful. And Nadera's point is really important here, politically speaking. The people who send us hate mail are not representative of the people out there in the Western world at large, right? We're talking, I think, increasingly about a very, very small minority of people who are still, trapped in what Blake would call the mind-forged manacles of denial, right? Or people, if you want to use a different metaphor, people who are drinking the Israeli or the Zionist Kool-Aid. That's, I think, the vast, or more and more and more people see what's happening, and it doesn't matter what kind of framing you put on it or the Israelis put on it. It's like people can see this with their own eyes. It doesn't take 6 PhDs to figure out what's happening when you look at Gaza in some sense. Yeah, there's a lot of filtering, as I said. Yeah, there's a lot of people don't know what white phosphorus is, because why would you unless you're obsessed with this kind of thing? But by and large, when you see entire neighborhoods being erased and you see this kind of thing, it's sort of clear. So I think, and I've been accused by various people of being wildly optimistic on these grounds, but I think the vast majority of people actually are or would be or are increasing, let's put it more mildly, more moderately. They get it, and they're on our side. And I think our Western governments are basically the last bastions and certain quarters of the media, but even the media are better than they used to be. The governments are the last, they're the last bastions. But then when I think back to our experience of the South African anti-apartheid struggle in the West, which I saw firsthand when I was a young student in the 1980s, it was the same thing then. The whole population got it, and our Western governments were the last ones. Like until the ship was sinking, basically, Then finally, the government of the US and UK and Canada finally said, oh, yeah, you're right. We need to do something about this apartheid system. But it was the last possible second. So I think that is important to bear in mind. The hate mail we get is not representative of what's out there. I think more and more people either aren't hobbled by these mechanisms of denial, or they're not drinking the Kool-Aid, or however you want to put it. But I also think our governments are still in hock, and they will be until basically the last possible second. So when we look at our governments for change, that's not what we should be looking. We should be talking to normal people who I think get it, fundamentally at some level.
Raz, you want to add to this comment? Let me just interject at this point to say to Saree's last point, there is a question in the Q&A about precisely this. I want to underline Nadera's point about the US. The US has to be stopped. This is so clear. Given the idea that there has to be some form of shift in opinion, what advice do you have for key strategies which all of us around the world can act on to amplify pressure on the US? So that's a question about that. Raz, I interrupted. You had your hand up. Would you all like to speak to this, Raz?
Nadera, do you want to respond? I just wanted to say, I think that, and that's why I raised the comparison to Russia's attack on Ukraine, which, by the way, also created a shift in the discourse on genocide. Right? It was really the first time in a long time that suddenly many liberal politicians around the world, who before would not tolerate, touching the hierarchy of Holocaust, genocide, everything else, right? Suddenly became very willing and open to entertain the idea of a Russian genocide on Ukraine, which is, I think, significant. But I just wanted to say that I agree completely with what you said, Nadera, that they should really, and with what you said, Sherene, about liberal education, right? I think that many people in the academic world today find it very difficult to continue to hold on to any kind of, last shreds of this idea. And I agree with you, Nadera, that it's about power. But what we're seeing, I think, since Russia's attack on Ukraine, and now more, right, is this kind of discourse that we're starting to see the end of the international political and legal system after World War II and after the Holocaust. And I think that the Holocaust, the ideas about the Holocaust and Holocaust memory, and I say the use of the Holocaust because, and I don't say abuse or misuse because it's all various kinds of uses of this history, right, is very central in this political and legal system. So if we're seeing the end of it, which I think is a potential to think, to imagine the world in a different way, including in Israel and in Palestine, without, again, what I alluded to after World War II and the Holocaust, reproducing, right, the problems, right, but now actually addressing them. And that's why I said, again, the statement that I quoted from more than 800 scholars of international law, Holocaust and genocide scholars, conflict study scholars. And I agree, Nadera, in Israel, almost all the hate mails that I'm getting these days are from Israelis, and some of them are very vicious, including some but outside of Israel, and Jews outside of Israel as well, and Jewish Holocaust and genocide study scholars outside of Israel, like me, there is a shift, and I think that it might also have an impact on power, I hope.
You know what? I want to say one thing. Also, the framing that it's against Jews is very problematic. It's not. It is not. Because number one, those that were injured were also Palestinians. Some of those that are injured today, that were injured in October 7th during the Hamas atrocities, were Palestinians. And it's not about Jews here or killing Jews. It's about a settler colonial entity that is grabbing the land, dispossessing people of life, of livability, of even burying their beloved ones in a dignified way. It's not about Jews and Arabs. It's about this entity that was created by the West. And believe me, when I think about my students here, listen, one of my colleagues' kids was injured. And it's not easy to accept it that much. As I think about my family in Gaza and my beloved ones, it's about people. And if we do not act really, and Sherene, you were asking, some of the questions were about what can we do. It's to speak up and to frame it differently. Really, and to stress that futures doesn't come, a better future doesn't come unless we talk about fairness, about equality, about the history of this dispossession, and that each and every person and child from the river to the sea can live in safety. And it's not about here, it's attack against Jews. So really, there is a need to reframe it, and to reframe it in a more humane manner.
I agree. I agree fully, Nadera. I said I think there's a conflation here of Jews and Israelis, and of Jews as a people and Israel as a state. I agree completely with what you said, fully.
That is a very powerful place on which to end this webinar. So many of the questions have to do with what do we do? What do we do in a moment when the Palestinian flag is equated with a Nazi emblem was one of the questions. What do we do when we confront this wall of denial? And it's a simple answer that Nadera gave. We have to reframe it, and to reframe it with humanity. Thank you all for this extraordinary conversation. Thank you to the, yes?
Would it be okay if I just read a brief thing to close us out today?
Absolutely. And let me just say thank you to everyone, and to remind you that a recording of this event will be posted on racialviolencehub.com. And now to Lubna. Muted.
Thank you to all of our panelists and to Professor Razack for organizing this. I was really inspired by the portion of the discussion that talked about the challenge of speaking up and speaking out here. And I wanted to share a passage from Indigenous activist and organizer Winona LaDuke, who spoke after the 2009 war on Gaza about why she thinks it was so tough to talk about Gaza here in Turtle Island. Quote, Euro-Americans in the United States can't talk about Gaza because we can't talk about Israel, because we can't talk about the fact that the world is not suffering from an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but that the world is suffering from the fact that Europe has never been able to deal with its Jewish question without some sort of intense barbarity and horror, from the Inquisition to the Holocaust. And that Europe, in particular Great Britain, the masters of divide and conquer, solved the problem by supporting the radical terrorist extremist Zionists and their mad plan to resettle the homeland. We can't talk about Israel because we can't talk about Wounded Knee, because we can't talk about Sand Creek or Carlisle boarding school, because we can't talk about forced sterilization or smallpox blankets or Kit Carson and his scorched earth policy in the Southwest, because we have Andrew Jackson on our $20 bill, because we are one huge settlement on stolen land. We can't talk about Israel because we are Israel.
Very powerful place to end. Thank you all again. Chris, if I could remind you to save the chat, the Q&A as well.